Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. My name is Glenn Ford. I'm a games designer and developer, and I'm here chatting to Mike Hutchinson.
I am also a games designer. Hey, Glenn.
Hey. And we are talking, as we want to do, about designing better miniatures games. So today we've decided that a good subject would be one that we alluded to in the last video. We'll actually follow through on one of our promises for once, and we'll have a conversation about activation systems. So funny enough, chronologically in a turn, I think we've been jumping around with some abandon. Activation systems obviously is something that's going to come towards the start of a given turn. So this is how you decide in what order players take their turns, how you decide what it is that they're allowed to activate and then move and fight and shoot with, wherever it happens to be during their turn. And it is, I think it's quite a rich area. I think it has quite a wide variety of options. And it's one of these things where, because it's up front and because it then can define everything that a player is able to do during their turn, it's often quite a small section in your rule book, but it has a very far-reaching effect. And as we're sort of chatting about this prior to coming on record, I think we're realizing is that there is a whole menu of little bits and pieces that you can actually sort of mix and match to create a whole range of effects.
I actually find this part of wargame design really fun, because even as you're sort of settling on some of your other mechanics around combat resolution and army building, like this for me remains an area that you can play with relatively low damage for quite a long time, seeing if would it be nicer if it was alternating or if it was IGOUGO. I think the other thing I guess to say in the preamble is, although we're talking about, or as we are talking about activation systems, we are necessarily going to also be talking about initiative systems, because they end up being really intertwined, even though they'll often be a separate heading in your rulebook.
So you mentioned in passing there two of, in my opinion, I think activation systems split out into roughly three overall categories. So that they filter out to lots of little branching elements that we'll chat about. And you opened up with what I'd say were probably the main two there, although just as a box out, I absolutely hate the names for them because they are literal.
They just don't make any sense.
So those two general categories are IGOUGO and alternating activation, which literally mean the same and perpetually confuse me. But IGOUGO
we'll come up with some better names for them. We'll popularize some semantically accurate names for them.
Yes. So IGOUGO is full force activation. It's your turn, you get to activate all of your stuff, or at least you get to do all of the activating that you're going to get to do this turn in a block, and then the other person does so, and then you go back and forth. And it might be
it's like block activation, or maybe I go for a while and then I wait for quite a while.
Yes. So, and then the second alternating activation is where I activate something other than all the activations I am going to do this turn. Quite often it's one unit, but very often there are ways of breaking out from it being just one unit, which we'll get to in a minute. And then you have a go activating some of, but usually not all of your stuff. And then we go back and forth. So we each take multiple goes at activating within a turn. And at some point we should talk about the language of splitting rounds and turns and turns. I take many turns in this turn, and then you take many anyway. And the third general category that I think breaks out quite differently from either of these is what I'm going to term generally sort of pull systems, which is where you've got sometimes a bag of chits, dice, other gubbins, or a deck of cards representing units, and you mix them up and then you pull one either out the bag or off the top of the deck, and that's what gets to activate. And I generally categorize these out a little bit because one of the things is that they can often mean that one person gets to go multiple times, and sometimes somebody else doesn't get to go in a given turn. And so they are, I think, very different from either of the other two. So yeah, I think in general terms, those would be the sort of the three main categories. They obviously have various advantages and disadvantages, and then they break out, I think, in lots of little ways, particularly as we said earlier about how you award initiative inside and outside of those turns, and et cetera, et cetera.
And also, I think, as we were sort of pointing to in the psychology episode, like you can then twist these a little bit by saying, okay, I activate my entire army, and then you activate your entire army, but then you can layer on unpredictability of troops. So you can say, well, you activate as much of your army as you can get away with some kind of push your luck system, and that adds additional sort of variations on these.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are various ways that you choose or chain or sort of create unit activations when each of those systems. We'll try and run through as many of the different ways that happens as we can sort of come up with in this conversation. Before we move on to some of that more sort of minutiae parts of it, I think it's worth having a quick conversation about the overall advantages and disadvantages of each of those sort of umbrella systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I think each of them, I think, has a fairly obvious disadvantage, or at least a major disadvantage. I think it's worth talking about. IGOUGO, the big thing I think that always comes up with IGOUGO systems is first turn-itis. Because in an IGOUGO system, I activate all of my stuff. If it's a game in which my stuff can significantly reach out and touch your stuff on its first activation, then inevitably, even on your first activation, you're going to have less stuff than I did, and you're going to be, even if it's a relatively minor disadvantage, inherently disadvantaged simply by that first initiative roll system.
And so that advantage to the first player, I think it still exists in alternating activation systems, where a powerful model, you can choose to activate an alpha strike and take out some other powerful model, and then suddenly the game is starting unbalanced. But it's so much more pronounced when I'm activating literally everything that I have paid for in my army and using it to demolish pieces of your army. Like it's not that unusual in that situation to see sort of 20 to 30% of the opposing players sort of army be removed from play even in that first turn, which means they're now starting from an enormous disadvantage, and depending on your initiative system, that could have been simply the roll of a single d6 that swung that.
Absolutely. And I think also in alternating activation systems, I think there's more of a feeling that the other person had to build for or play for a significant level of being able to alpha strike, because you can only activate a relatively small percentage of your force. If you have a force where a single activation can make a significant alpha strike, you've usually paid for that privilege.
Right.
And so it feels a bit more like, well, yeah, fair enough. You put a bunch of points into this one usual sort of glass cannon dude, and they've run in and they've ripped the heart out of me, but now I just bonk them over the head and you have a relatively weak force remaining. So it's easier to balance out. And I think it's significant that I think because of that, in IGOUGO systems, you often see quite a bit of work put into trying to figure out how to balance out this first turn-itis. And I think there are things like, as you were saying before, when a game says, okay, the thing's dead, but it still gets to activate until the end of the turn, and then we take it off at the end of the turn, which is a very neat way of just going, okay, the first turn-itis doesn't really exist. You get to do what you get to do, but everything's going to be functional to the end of the turn.
Yeah, so my favorite example of that recently is Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse, the third edition boxed version of that, which basically is a completely different game based on old school Space Marine and Epic. And that simply you pop damage tokens down on units, but damage itself is only resolved at the end of everyone's activities during a single round of play, and so everybody gets to activate their models regardless of when damage was assigned during the turn.
And it's weird that that sometimes sounds counterintuitive when you first hear of it, but obviously all the turns are simultaneous. You know, we do if there's two armies lined up on a battlefield, they don't actually one person marches and fires and attacks, and the other people just sit there waiting, and then they there go. Obviously, it's all happening at once, so it makes perfect sense that something that you blew up on turn one still gets to activate on turn one, because it all happened at once. Other ways of fixing that is to try and make the turn ordering more tactical and something that you pay for, and etc. etc. But that is tough to do when a first turn can be so significant. And the last thing is simply to, and this is more of a system thing, is simply have a game where people can't really do that much damage on turn one anyway. You know,
well, there's an extreme version of that which you see often in board game design, which is the player with the first turn simply does not get access to a certain kind of activity. So, you know, maybe the person with the first turn is disallowed from shooting or something similar.
Yeah, and if you are playing a game where the vast majority of, or even all of the stuff is close combat, then first turn isn't that much of a significant advantage. It's much more of a problem when you're playing some sort of sci-fi game where everyone's got big old laser cannons that they can rip holes in people with from a distance.
Yeah, engagement range versus sort of setup range is essentially the key differentiator.
Yeah, and I think it's also why a lot of games that can weaken out shooting lean towards weakening out shooting, even more than would be advantageous for the design otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's not certainly the only reason, but like that's one of the reasons for the classic bolt guns seem to, like, their bullets drop to the ground after about 30 meters.
So I think that's the one of the biggest problems about IGOUGO. Alternating activation, in my opinion.
Well, can we talk about the other big problem of IGOUGO, which is downtime, player downtime. So one of the key reasons I often avoid IGOUGO systems is it forces you to work harder as a games designer to find reasons to keep the passive player engaged during the active player's turn, because particularly in an army game, a round of moving and making decisions about shooting and target priority and all that kind of stuff, it's fairly regular that an entire army activation could take maybe 30 minutes. And so the question that you need to answer as a games design is, in what ways is that an engaging experience for the person sat on the other side of the table? And in many games, a game like Kings of War, I think, is a particularly interesting example where the purity of the design principles for Kings of War essentially said the other player does not need to be present during my turn. And that was very much built into, but I think it asks this very, it doesn't answer a very important question of what am I supposed to be doing if I'm not playing the game? Do I simply play half the game? Of course, chess has the same problem, and the answer with chess and Kings of War is think very deeply about your strategy so that you are ready to leap from your seat, smash the chess clock, and act with swift strategic confidence. But for me, I tend to write games that are a little bit softer than that, and so I think I am very thoughtful about, does my system provide enough decision making on the other side of the table during the other person's turn? If not, I would seriously consider an alternating activation where the gap between me making decisions is significantly lessened.
Yeah, and again, obviously, putting in things like reactions to things happening. So someone charges you, you get a reaction to make to it. You can stand and fire with your weapons, or you can run away, or you can hold, or having units that reaction activate, like pop out when somebody comes within a certain distance of them. So letting people do things in the other person's phase is one way of sort of dealing with that, or simply splitting out your IGOUGO to a phase. So it's I take a movement phase, you take a movement phase, I take a shooting phase, you take a shooting phase, which allows you to sort of chop up the sandwich a little bit more. So
I think that's a very nice halfway house between these two core systems, which I I think is well worth investigating. Uh, I've used it recently in a couple of designs because of it's a neat answer to that. The other minor disadvantage I will just peg on the end of this list for IGOUGO is you sort of referenced it a little bit in terms of like, you know, armies are simultaneously running at each other. Like it's actually the most extreme abstraction of like real time on the battlefield. And I think we've accepted it because a lot of us historically have played games with this system. But when you start playing more alternating activation games, I think you can, there is a risk that you return to IGOUGO systems and go, wow, this is really like oddly abstracted. And like, I just literally stand here doing nothing whilst an entire army walks towards me. All games are abstraction, but I just think it's sort of an aesthetic decision.
It's funny though, I mean, on that side of things, my feeling about it sometimes is that what's weird in alternating activations is that the first unit that I activate on my side during a turn sometimes activates like half an hour prior to the last unit that I activate. That two guys next to each other, one of them has run forward, killed somebody, been shot with an arrow, and then hacked down in close combat before the other guy has even twitched for his first movement. So I think some of these things, you know, it's a bit like, I often feel like alternate activation is actually more abstracted for me than IGOUGO in that respect, because it feels like, well, obviously all of my guys march forward simultaneously. Look at me pushing. I can literally push 2 units next to each other as they march up, whereas one guy running forward having a whole lifetime of stuff happening while the other guy goes, oh, I'm next to him while this is happening. As he's fighting, I'm actually stood next to him. Just doesn't look that way. It looks like I'm running up there half an hour after while he's already dead. But
gentle listener, I think you are finding that Glenn and I both strangely gravitate towards this weird midpoint where you activate your entire force, but you only get to do it within that one phase, and then you move on to the next phase. And
well, I mean,
it is a lovely midpoint.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think there's a whole bunch. I think in truth, and I think Paul will probably come out with this conversation, is that all of the extremes of any of these systems are better when they are leavened with bits and pieces and tweaks and twiddles, and there's a whole menu of malarkey that you can throw in to allow you to do that. So going on to alternating activation disadvantages, since I just opined on my feelings about its version of a timing disconnect, I think the biggest downside for alternating activation is it in its own way has switchover downtime.
That's right.
Different sort of downtime. It doesn't feel as painful because you feel like you're doing something all the time. But alternating activations, when I stop doing something and you start doing something, every single time that happens, there's a little chunk of time where you have to go, all right, okay, what was the board state again? What was I doing? Where's all my stuff? What's happened since last time I went? What was my plan? I had a plan. I was doing a thing with that guy. Right, now I can start doing things.
And I think that's actually that board state changing every time I move a piece, I think is absolutely the critical part, because there is an element to which, like in board games, there's just like a natural downtime where like, Glenn, it's your turn. Glenn, it's your turn. It's your turn, Glenn. And like those little moments add up over a game, certainly. But it's more, as you exactly say, it's like, well, every time I go to move a piece, the board state has changed and I have to reassess everything. Whereas if we're in an IGOUGO system, I go, right, I know what I'm doing. I've visualized every move that I'm about to make. So I'm just going to act on that and move everything to the places. And maybe there's a couple of moments where there's like some uncertainty. And I think we'll get into why that's interesting, but essentially I can complete an entire strategic operation in one go, and that's much quicker and avoids this sort of analysis time that then gets baked into the handover moment.
Yeah, and I think that handover time extension is such a sort of dead time. There's no benefit to the extra time, and it's
sort of dead for everyone, because it's not even that satisfying a moment for the active player. It's a moment of sort of mild panic and self-irritation where it's like, what the hell was I doing? And I think that critically for a design, that that extension of your game experience, like the total elapsed duration of your game, like that's a big compromise that you need to figure out if it is sufficiently fun, if it's sufficiently awesome to have alternating activations, that it's worth that cost. And I think it often is, but it's definitely a balancing question.
And it is potentially quite a big cost, because you know, when that dead time adds up, it's like, it's one thing the dead time of somebody else taking a turn where you're like, well, at least somebody's having fun. You know, the dead time that adds up on an alternating activation game is sometimes where you go, oh, crikey, this game took 2 hours and a solid 45 minutes of it was actually everyone just sitting there going, huh? You know, so yeah, so that it can be an issue, and trying to find ways of, you know, mitigating that, letting people be able to pre-plan irrespective of what the board state's going to be, I think is helpful. You know, pre-warning when the switchover is going to come, not mucking around too much with the nature of the switchover. And one of the things are the ways in which you can mess with initiative and put in chain activations and things like that to allow people to do more planning prior to activating, you know, or good ideas. And last of all, let's say that the pull system, which I think is neither fish nor fowl in this particular example, where it's like, so various systems say that each unit is designated one or another token. There'll be sometimes dice that you dump into a bag, sometimes little tokens and chits, like in Test of Honor, you stick into a bag, or each unit will be represented with a card.
We're talking here about Bolt Action and the family of Rick Pleasley games that use that dice pool system. I think, you know, Drop Fleet Commander with its deck of detachment cards that pop out, battle group cards that pop out. I think also, like, I would maybe put Infinity into this system, because each unit generates an activation token, and then, you know, in a twist on this system, you then get to spend those in a fairly flexible and free way. But it is still like a
well,
it's got elements of the pool system.
Yeah, well, I think thing about Infinity is, I think it's an interesting twist on an activation point system, and I think activation point systems is one of the things that we can talk about in a minute in one of these breakdowns. Whereas I think what's kind of central to the pull systems we're talking about here is that they are random, that you have no control over what's coming out of the bag, and it is it's meant to be, I think it can be one of their strengths. It's sort of like, you know, the chaos of war, we don't know who's going to activate, and it is definitely, I think, for people who don't like it, their biggest weakness, because it gives a lot of, you know, random number generation control to a given turn. I could say Test of Honor is a perfect example where one player can activate their entire force while the other player literally doesn't get a turn. In the Test of Honor system, and
you can, and as a designer, you can say, well, that's very rare and it wouldn't really happen. But of course, with all of these things that rely on random chance, you have to design for that, because it will happen at scale as players play it, and someone's going to have a really bad game.
And while the extremes will tend not to happen very, very often, there's going to be spikes and troughs. And certainly, whilst in Test of Honor, it's often exciting to sort of go, oh, when is my guy going to activate, when he's going to activate, there are regular turns where you go, all right, you get a third turn in a go, brilliant. Oh, that feels fantastic for me. And yeah, I think personally there's an interesting variation between the card systems and the bag pull systems, because obviously the thing about the card pull system is that you know that the deck is going to become stacked at some point. You know that you're going to get all of your stuff to activate. Whereas in a bag pull system, quite often things go back into the bag at an irregular rate, and so sometimes it's like,
if they do, that could be a design challenge, or a design flaw.
Yeah.
The other option, of course, is that, you know, with the dice bag, or the deck of cards, like, another option is to, you know, you can either combine those into a single pool, which gives you the joy of the random, I don't know if it's you or me, but of course you can leave those separate and say, okay, we know it's going to be me, then you, then me, then you, but we don't know who or what kind of unit, and that has its own problems as well, but it solves one problem to create a new one.
Yeah, And of course, the pull systems. If we're talking about the fact that there's changeover downtime for an alternating activation system, the fact that in an alternating activation system, at least I know what it is that I'm going to activate when I get a go to activate. In a pull system, not only am I sort of having to reassess the board state, I'm now like, okay, well, who am I allowed to activate, or even what am I allowed to do with them?
Is there anything else about activation that we haven't covered? I suppose there's a minor sidebar here about like we talked about block activation where you do your entire army, or a sort of atomic activation where you activate a specific model or a specific unit. Of course, there are games that use a kind of detachment system where units are represented individually, but you group them together into battle groups or detachments. And so that can sort of be a halfway house where we alternate activations of maybe a quarter of our army, and that sort of finds a little middle ground between it.
Well, I think if we're sort of continuing to talk about some of the variations and activation systems themselves, I think again it's a game that I think we referred to a few times on this channel because it does some things so very well. X-Wing, the miniatures game, I think does something very interesting with its activation system because it has an alternating activation of actually moving your actual physical models during your activation phase. But what it cleverly does is it boxes out all of your decisions, and it lets you make all of those decisions on a static board state, and then only asks you to interact with a changing board state within the alternating activation part with things that where a lot of your choices have been preset.
Right. So quite specifically, like the big decision about which movement template are you going to select is made in a quiet moment whilst the board state is static, but you are still given, as the turn unfolds in initiative order, like you're still given one interesting but relatively, like it's a relatively unimpactful decision about which action am I going to take? And I probably have a very small menu of those. And so it still gives you this one little decision, but which is dependent on the board state. But as you say, most of it's taken at the beginning.
And it smartly removes the downtime problem, because the decision-making part it's if you can find a way of doing simultaneous decision making, like the chunk of simultaneous decision making in a tabletop game, then I think that is a really neat design element. It's really hard to do simultaneous stuff in tabletop games, tabletop miniatures games, just because you physically operating the stuff on the tabletop is actually quite involved.
Yeah.
Whereas the way that X-Wing says, okay, you're both making the big decisions at the same time because nothing's going to be changing. You can do it together. So there's very little downtime, or at least very little perception of downtime, because I'm fiddling with my dials while you're fiddling with your dials. And there's the bluffing into play of, oh, he put that one down really quickly. I'll readjust. I can readjust my dial until we both go, all right, hands off.
Yeah, and even if you finish fast and I'm still going, like there's still a moment of sort of poker-like psychology that you can kind of go, okay, like where's his eyes going? Like has he got any tells about what's going on there? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a really interesting variation on this, and I think it's made possible by the geometricness of the square units and the stable constrained discrete movement options, which is something obviously that Gaslands has a bit of, but constrained discrete movement, it's almost in our definition as if it has constrained discrete movement, it's not a tabletop miniatures hobby war game of the sort that we're talking about. And that's one of the things about X-Wing that's kind of awkward to talk about, is that it kind of breaks the definition in a couple of directions, but still certainly feels like a miniature war game.
I think that the thing about X-Wing is that its deployment phase drops in that sort of totally non-discrete element of the game. It's maybe it's only 1 point, but it does.
I know, but yeah, like once you realize that you don't have to put them square on as they enter the board, that you can put them at 17.5 degrees, and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, there is a theoretical infinity of choice within a given deployment phase where you put each ship. So it does still have that branching out spread of decisions and freedom that we're looking for from these sorts of games. So I think that's an interesting one, where that's a sort of an option for hybridization, where if you can find a way to make simultaneous some of that decision making, and if you can box out some of the activation systems away from all of the actual fiddling with bits and pieces on the tabletop part of the game, you can cut out a lot of these problems. But you have to do something quite clever in order to make that boxing out work and make it happen. And I think it's, I say, X-Wing has a lot of advantages because of its quite sort of discrete movement systems, but there are ways of letting people box out other bits and pieces. There are ways that you can say, okay, here's a set of order cards that you've got in your hand, you know, although it's like, okay, I'll move this unit 4 inches or 6 inches, you can still have a card that says move, a card that says hunker down, a card that says charge. And even you can say, okay, you've got 2 charge cards, you've got 4 move cards, and you've got 2 hunker down cards, and you've got 8 units. You know, now even though it's like, okay, how far I charge or how far I move is going to be crinkly within the actual movement phase, you can still, to a degree, box out a lot of that activation decision making. And again, you can award those cards initiative values. Because one of the big things that X-Wing does is it sets out the order that ships are going to move, so you don't have that downtime moment in alternating activation of going, all right, well, who am I going to move? Which guy? I've got to pick between my entire force, and every one of them is going to do something to his side. Which one did he activate? Which ones has he activated? Which ones hasn't he activated? If you just give people a set of cards that says order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even simply a handful of tokens numbered for the number of units they've got from 1 to however many, and you just say, in our orders phase, you pop those tokens next to your units, that's the order they activate in. I think that can very happily pull out a whole bunch of that unpleasant downtime of an alternating activation system, and I think it's something that possibly hasn't been considered sufficiently.
There's a couple of games that I have that aren't published yet, which use playing cards very much for this reason. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Cobblestones and Kobolds uses this idea to some good effect as well from the Osprey Wargames line. But the idea that you have a hand of playing cards, and that those are the things that you can use to activate units. And as you say, the affordance of the number on that card could be their initiative, or it could be the strength. So it could be that I've got a series of cards and I've got a 10 and I want to hold that for my big boss to do a really strong attack, and so I'm going to waste these little 1s and 5s on less significant tactical maneuvers. And of course, the other affordances on the cards being their suits or their colors that can give you access to, okay, maybe these are the different orders, or in the case of one of my designs, like you can play a number, which is the strength of the attack, but the suit gives you a certain bonus, like, okay, this suit gives you armor penetration, or this suit gives you extra range, or this suit gives you whatever. So I think as you're exploring your design and your activation system, I think my closing thought on activation systems is that there's so much delightful variety in what you can do, and it also changes the game experience so fundamentally that even outside of all of the other mechanics and narratives and everything that's going on, I just think, like, experiment more with activation systems, because they can really positively move the game experience for the players.
Yeah, I think my closing thought on the activation systems generally is that the number one rule, I think we always say in these game design conversations, is that choices are good. However, choices can come with a price, and for your design, and activation choices probably come with one of the biggest costs, because of that downtime that we're talking about. And if you can find ways to box out that time into some sort of sub phase, if you can help players to pre-visualize what they're going to do so that you can lessen that downtime, if you can just find ways to pay the cost that your players are going to have to pay for them before asking it of them, I think it will sort of come back tenfold. Because like I say, you want to give people choices, but you want to help guide them. I think particularly in the activation phase through some of those choices, because yeah, I mean, this is the reason it's so hard to write a chess program for a computer, is because having to go through every possible option before doing anything is mentally crushing.
Yeah,
Right.
and the more times that you ask the player to make that calculation with different board states, the heavier the game feels.
Yeah. Okay, so we will, I think, round off on that part of this conversation, the basic overall umbrella systems. I think we'll move on to some of the initiative systems.
And maybe talking about the order systems, or maybe that'll even need a third conversation. Goodness.
That would be splendid and thrilling. Yeah, we'll talk about some, possibly at least some initiative systems, some of the ways in which activations break down within some of these overall umbrella systems, and some of the ways you can mix and match some of these systems and ideas to lessen the problems and heighten the strengths of the overall, I've said system about 5 times, but systems that you're putting in place here. Okay, so for now, we will sign off on this particular conversation. If you've watched through to this point, I assume you like some part of what we are doing. If you do, please like and subscribe somewhere around on the various buttons. If you don't like what we're doing, or if you just have opinions on some of the things we've said, if you think we've missed out a big old activation element within our roundup, please let us know. Let us know which of the systems is your favorite one. Let us know whether you think I did say systems too much, or if you think I should say systems a few more times. Let us know your thoughts and feelings. Reach out to us on social media as usual. But for now, we're going to sign off and say bye from this episode.
Bye-bye.